10th annual CGI University meeting comes to a close, I want to congratulate and thank you for the commitments you've made to your campuses, your communities, and our world. Over the past decade, CGIU has called on students to identify the world's most pressing challenges and to be bold in developing solutions. You are now part of a community of thousands of change makers, and one of the strongest tools at your disposal as a member of the CGIU community is the community itself. This network of passionate, ambitious people ready to help your commitment to action succeed. So I hope you'll stay in touch with the people you've met here and use them as a resource. I also hope you won't let the spirit of problem solving end when this conference does. Next time you think, someone ought to do something about that, remember, that someone could be you. Whether it's combating climate change, expanding access to education, ensuring human rights, civil rights, women's rights, or LGBT rights, don't sit on the sidelines, be part of the solution. There's an African proverb I've always loved. If you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. You're off to a great start. Now keep going with each other. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vice Chair, Clinton Foundation, Chelsea Clinton.
Oh, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I hope that you've had a terrific weekend so far. I know that I certainly have. I've loved meeting some of you and hope to meet more of you after this evening and tomorrow during our day of action. I just am continually impressed, awed, encouraged, and kind of left with such a sense of optimism after every interaction I have with anyone who comes to CGIU. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us. And I want to impose on you to join me in a litany, I think, of important gratitude before we get to our final plenary session. First and foremost, once again, I'd like to thank President Ayoun and all of our prosts here at Northeastern University. I want to thank the faculty, the administration, the staff. I want to thank everyone who's ensured all of us have been kind of well fed and well hydrated. I want to thank all of the student volunteers. Really, without your warm hospitality and welcome, none of this would have been as possible or as much fun as it has been thus far. So please give Northeastern another round of applause. I also want to thank Bill Wetzel and the entire CGI University team for all of their work year-round to ensure that this weekend is a meaningful, productive experience, and that we can best support you once you leave here tomorrow. So I know there was sort of a smattering of applause, but please give Bill and his team a round of applause. I'd like to thank all of the people who came and were mentors, who participated in the skill sessions, who served on plenaries, who've had conversations with you in the halls. I'd like to thank all of the previous CGIU students, the alums who have come back and continue to come back to really help ensure that those of you who are here for the first time not only can navigate this, but can maximize the impact of your commitments to action. So please give all of the CGIU mentors and skill session leaders and plenary panelists a round of applause. And finally, I just want to thank all of you. Thank you for coming and believing in the importance of engagement, in persistence, in indefatigable optimism. Kind of thank you for your just fierce conviction that you know that if you do indeed make a commitment and you take it into action, you will make a profound difference. So please give yourselves a round of applause. And although we call this the closing plenary, I certainly hope that we will see all of you tomorrow in Roxbury for our Day of Action. We'll start with a rally at Madison Park Technical Vocational High School and then go into the community on a variety of service projects. And I know that my father and I are going to hopefully get to all of them. So I hope that all of you will join us. Now, kind of on to the important business at hand, the winners of the Codeathon and the Commitment Challenge. This year's Codeathon prompt asked students to develop digital solutions to improve or facilitate energy efficiency in urban environments. Each team came up with bold visions and plans and were incredibly exciting in how much they had generated in just 36 hours. I wish that we could have had as many winners as we had participants, but having to choose one team, we chose Team Wiser. Their members include Sam Rual, Tadatan Damdoma Koa, Gabrielle Wilson, Lindsay Martin, Tepiwa Ziventwa, and they together created a mobile application to learn users' tastes and wastes to help create dynamic, personalized shopping lists in order to waste less food, ensure that all food that someone would have bought would be put to good use, to save people money, and importantly, to help people lower their carbon footprint in the process. So please give them another round of applause. Oh, wait, they're from different schools. They're from different schools, and I don't know who's from which school. So she's from Virginia Commonwealth University. So there you go. I should know that. I'm sorry that I didn't. Next year. See, this is also like improvement for me too, so thank you for the feedback. And finally, before we move on to our conversation that will conclude this programmatic part of CGI University, I'm thrilled to announce the winners of the CGIU Commitments Crowdfunding Challenge. Starting on September 14th, 60 teams competed to raise money and awareness for their commitments through a partnership between CGIU and Next Step. We had participants from all over the world gathered together in 16 teams, and they were charged with raising awareness about their issue, awareness about their commitment to action, and funds to help facilitate their commitment to action into reality. Those who raised the most money were entered into a March Madness, although I know it's October, style bracket competition. The top 16 teams competed in 4 successive rounds in head-to-head competition, and kind of the awareness raised and the dollars raised were reset with each new competition, so there wasn't an unfair carryover advantage. We're really excited to share that your collective efforts set a record in CGIU Commitments Challenge history. Over $71,000 was raised, and yes. And the winning team, who raised a total of $18,025, are comprised of AJ Wilson and Ria Drusdino from Wesleyan University. And their commitment is called Dream Chasers. This is AJ. Ria couldn't be with us, unfortunately. So yes, please give AJ another round of applause. Thank you. They've committed to develop an after-school peer mentorship program that provides college readiness and leadership trainings to middle school and high school students in Kennesaw, Georgia. Building off their 2016 commitment, which was featured in Nickelodeon, NPR, and elsewhere, They'll work with partners including Choose ATL, the Atlanta Bar Association, and the City of Kennesaw to recruit student participants and potential program donors. And they hope to dramatically increase the high school graduation rate of their program participants to at least 80%. So please give AJ and Rhea, who we wish were here, a round of applause. So just again, a tremendous congratulations and gratitude to not only the winners of the Commitments Challenge and the Codathon, but to all of you who participated and all of you who are here with us this weekend and have been part of the CGIU community over the previous 10 years. And I'm just so grateful to have a conversation with two men I have long admired and have known for possibly longer than you might expect. Well, probably not my dad, since you know I've known him since I was born. But the great Congressman Joe Kennedy is someone I've known since we were at Stanford together and have admired for, thank you for the Stanford whistle, have admired for as long as I have known him. He has proven himself to be an extraordinary leader, one I think we are particularly grateful for at this moment in time, with his focus on breaking stigma around issues related to mental health, ensuring that breaking stigma is also connected to greater treatment access and support, that he is deeply committed to our LGBTQ Americans at this moment in time and protecting equal rights and access, that he is ensuring we don't lose focus on areas where we have made real progress, whether that's from early childhood education or to support more investments in STEM education, particularly for girls. And he is a tireless advocate and champion for his constituents right here in the Boston area. So I just am so, and you can applaud for Boston. As we talked about yesterday, this should be as interactive as you'd like. So I just am really thankful that he is taking time to be with all of us. I look forward to listening to him, as I always do, and every time my father speaks, particularly about some of our pressing challenges and issues that he has been working on now for many decades, I certainly always learn something from him as well. So I feel incredibly lucky to be sharing the stage with both of them. We hope this will be an interactive conversation, so we hope that you will tweet questions. While we will sort of exploit the fact that we get to kick it off, we really hope this can largely be driven and shaped by what you would like to hear any of our reflections on, thoughts about. So please ask questions. We know that you're not shy, and I just am really thankful that we can close with a conversation about some of what we've talked about already this weekend, but really also be reflective of what you're going to carry forward as you leave this weekend and go back to your campuses and your communities. So please join me in welcoming both my father, President Clinton, and Congressman Joe Kennedy to the stage.
Am I up?
I think you're up.
So here's the deal. We're going to hear mostly from the Congressman and Chelsea. We're going to talk about leadership in a way that changes people's lives, and we're going to try to use primarily for examples, just to organize the conversation, practical responses to climate change and the energy crisis and the opioid crisis, which we had a panel on earlier, mostly because it's a big focus of the Clinton Foundation. We're obsessed with trying to figure out what we can do to be more effective, and because it's a very grave thing. But then we're going to take some questions that will come up on the screen. So let's begin with this. Congressman, since we can't expect anytime soon sweeping climate change legislation to pass the Congress, what would you tell these young people their responsibilities and their opportunities are to reduce greenhouse gases and reduce the chances of a calamitous consequence of doing nothing?
So with that as an easy softball to start, first off, let me just say how honored and thrilled I am to be here with all of you, how inspired I am by the work that you do, by the way that you consistently and through everything try to find innovative ways to solve people's problems, which I think is what government is supposed to do. We're struggling with that a little bit at the moment. I won't go farther than that, but it is an extraordinary, humbling experience for me tonight to be here with all of you, for folks that are using your talent and ingenuity in different ways of looking at the world to do so. And obviously, for me to be able to share the stage with President Clinton and Chelsea, who I think the world of, is a rare honor for me as well. So thank you both for including me tonight. To actually, yeah, give them a round of applause, I mean, please, my God. So I'm actually going to go at this a little bit harder than President Clinton said, and just say, look, this isn't a question of what can you do. Folks, we're depending on you, right? There are those of us that do believe that the federal government has a responsibility to act on systemic challenges and global challenges like climate change, but in the absence thereof, we need you to fill that gap. We need you to find ways to address these concerns. We need you to prove what works so that at the very least, government can come in behind you and scale it. We need your talent and your ingenuity, and if you're not gonna do it, nobody else will, because we have proven at this point that the federal government, for a variety of reasons, mostly political in nature, does not have the political will to address this crisis, and in fact, is rolling back. So what can you do? Look, the President and I were talking backstage about some of the projects that CGI has gotten behind and some of the projects that they've learned, and I'll let him speak about that. But everything from creating apps to community organizations to finding new solutions to some of these challenges that do plague our society, to joining a lawsuit, right? Which there is, in fact, a series of lawsuits that have been filed in federal court by young Americans to try to say, look, there is by not acting on this, you are putting an entirely new generation at risk, not just financially, but for, under the lawsuit, in the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I would urge you not just to say, what can you do, but I would urge you to take that mantle and run with it, because particularly in the absence of the action that I think many of us desire, you are our best hope.
And I emphatically agree with everything that the Congressman said. I also would urge you to, for those of you that are American citizens or studying here in the United States, to look at your local and state representatives as well as being important interlocutors in the fight against climate change, and expect them to act responsibly in the fight against climate change. And whether that is around the building codes that are written and overseen, regulated at the local level, to ensure that those are more climate smart and in the vanguard of fighting climate change, whether that's at the state level about what products are going to be certified to be sold kind of in your state or not. We're seeing lots of interesting kind of ideation and activism in California right now, as California is saying, we're expecting companies that are based here or companies that want to sell products here to be climate smart actors. If you want to sell plastic products here, kind of these are the protocols you have to follow. We're seeing lots of innovation in recycling at the local and county level across the country. So I would also just urge those of you who may kind of feel as I do that, notwithstanding Joe and some of his more kind of science-believing, data-believing colleagues are distraught about what's happening in Washington on many days, particularly as relates to climate change, to not think that, therefore, kind of government has no role to play. I think the answer is to continue to put pressure on the federal government, but also really look to your state and local governments as having a lot of potential to be positive actors at this moment in time, and also to then help create examples that kind of the federal government, hopefully, in the not too distant future can follow. Please.
I want you to think about something, a couple of things that are specific. First of all, remember Darren, who spoke today in the Hall of Fame of our CGIU alumni. You remember he said he was born in a one-room apartment in Bed-Stuy, and he had to use the kitchen oven and leave open the door to stay warm. And so he started his business doing inventories for people with very limited incomes to maximize the efficiency and therefore lower the cost and increase the impact of the energy they use, especially in the winter. You should think about that everywhere. That's something everybody can do. We are still highly inefficient in the way we use energy, even though we are roughly 3 times as efficient as we were 40 years ago. So, first. Second, if you live out west, meaning in this case, if you live anywhere west of the Mississippi, you should know that in all probability, you have access to solar and wind combined sources that could provide virtually all the electricity in your area. Iowa has the lowest baseload electric cost in America, 5.8 cents a kilowatt hour, because it has the highest percentage of its baseload in wind power. California has a 30% renewable energy standard going to 50%. The poorest people in America are the Native Americans who live on tribal lands without casinos. Those who live certainly from Wyoming down to Arizona and west could have wind farms, sell the energy to California, take the profits, and diversify. Meanwhile, they could all have free electricity from on-site solar. So I think, there are lots of things you could do, and if you want to lower the disparity between opportunity in small town and rural areas and the rest of America, one thing we ought to do is bring the benefits of clean energy and energy efficiency to them in ways we've failed to do so far.
The only thing else I'd add is, being in Congress now for the last couple of years, we do struggle as a nation trying to make the case about federal action on global goods, right? Climate change being one of them, because we say, well, if we do, but China doesn't or India doesn't, we're going to pay the price of them. I think what you all have a unique opportunity to do is change that focus, just as the president said, not from looking at this as climate change as an international or national crisis, although it is, but make this local, right? Where I see this, where this hits me locally, is when my mayors, the communities that I represent, ask me for more federal dollars to pay for their combined sewage overflow and wastewater treatment, because when we do get those 100-year storms, which, by the way, are happening every couple of years, they can't deal with the water runoff. And they then start polluting rivers, and they have to pay a fine under the EPA, and they're looking for money to fix it. That's a climate change problem. When we've redrawn flood maps, and homeowners that weren't in a flood map before now are, and now they are forced to look at massive increase in flood insurance rates, to some extent, so it's more than their mortgage. And they can't afford to choose between insurance and a mortgage. That's a climate issue. But we can localize this and force our country to take action piece by piece, where the federal government at this point refuses to do so. And I would localize this as much as we can.
Yeah, if I could just give you one other example. Yeah, let's give him a hand. I live in Westchester County in New York, which is about 20 miles north of the city. And the largest solar installation in our county is on the headquarters grounds of Swiss Re. The big reinsurance company whose American headquarters are about 10 minutes from my home. Now, why are they doing that? Because they're going out there telling all these cities and other business facilities who want them to reinsure their activity to protect them from ruin, that climate change is real, there are practical solutions, and we want to set a good example, and if you don't, we're not going to insure you anymore. So it's very interesting. If your whole economic future depends on whether you see the world as it is, not as it ideologically you'd like it to be, the rest of us can take a clue from that. And companies like that will help projects like things you could do to try to improve things, and you will always, always, always create jobs. There are now 13,000 jobs in the Pittsburgh area in solar power, more than in Appalachia in coal. So you really have to think about this in practical terms. Now, let's talk about the opioid epidemic. I'm really worried that the announcements on the cutbacks in healthcare subsidies will put new strains on state and local community health programs. But let's just assume it stays the way it is now. We got into this at the Clinton Foundation through our health and efforts. And we wanted to try to help young people stay alive, and so we worked hard to get naloxone or Narcan available, first at lower cost and ultimately in free dosages in colleges and universities. But obviously, that's not a solution to this problem. So we're trying to figure out, you give us some advice. What can we do to empower people all over America to try to break the back of this epidemic? And what can you do? Because otherwise, we can all sit here and complain that the only people who get decent drug treatment and have a real chance to break this come from families like ours. That is not a sustainable approach. But bringing people back with Narcan and then getting them to detox and then repeating the whole thing all over again is not a sustainable approach either. So you can think about that. But Congressman, you want to start?
So first, for those of you that are here and live in the United States, those of you that raised your voices over the last 10 months on this healthcare debate, look, Medicaid is the largest payer of mental and behavioral health services in this country, and those various repeal efforts that went through over the course of the past several months and are still ongoing now by executive action would have devastated Medicaid. So for those of you that raised your voices to protect those programs, a huge and heartfelt thank you. That's one thing you can do and you need to do. And we need you to keep doing it. Second, this is such a complex problem that's hard for many folks to figure out where exactly can we plug in. And I think the advice that I'd like to give you is plug in where you think you have a potential solution. I'll give you one example that I was reading about earlier today, which is amazing and which is, I think, a tribute to the ingenuity and the talent that we're seeing in young people across our country and around the world. So Ohio has been, like Massachusetts, has been particularly devastated by opioid epidemic. There was a high school in Ohio that decided to start a drug-free club. And it quickly, in the course of a year, became the most popular club in that high school. You had to take a drug test to get in, and throughout the course of the year, you were subject to random drug testing. If you were a member of it, you also got a photo ID card. Now, what that photo ID card actually got you was the club went out to local businesses across the community and was able to negotiate discounts for the pizza place, at the ice cream store, at local community establishments, where those community members and those stores recognized what these kids were doing and the devastating impact of the opioid epidemic and was willing to give discounts to high school students that committed to stay drug-free. And this quickly became not just something that was obviously having remarkable impacts for public health, but for high school students that were looking to be able to actually afford to take somebody on a date on the weekend, if you could get an extra couple bucks off the movies, that was worthwhile. And we've seen programs like that actually succeed across the country. This one particularly innovative. There's nothing stopping anybody else from doing that or from taking your own slightly different slant on it. It's programs like that that I also find so exciting, particularly at a time that can be rather depressing in Washington, to know that that level of ingenuity, that level of stick-to-itiveness, that level of inspiration is out there. We just have to be able to highlight it and tap into it. So good on you for giving it a shot.
I also think something that Joe highlights in sharing that anecdote is the right answers for both creating a culture of prevention as well as simultaneously ensuring that culture of prevention is moving toward destigmatizing addiction, is that there are as many right answers as there are places where this is a challenge. Because I completely agree that kind of programs like that can be innovated anywhere and everywhere, but they're like that, they're not that program. And so kind of thinking about what is most locally relevant and resonant and likely to be most locally impactful, I think is hugely important. I also think that trying to bring in more people and institutions into this conversation, even if they're unlikely, is an important dynamic. One of the places where in some communities the highest number of overdoses are occurring are public libraries. In other communities, it's fast food restaurants. In other communities, it's public parks. In other communities, it's in people's own homes. And so also ensuring that while we're creating a culture of prevention that hopefully also moves to destigmatization, we have to continue to save lives wherever we can. So ensuring that interventions that we know work, like Narcan and naloxone, that are an immediate antidote and give enough time to get someone to the hospital, hopefully into treatment, we have to continue to go to where people are suffering and in so much pain so that we can help save their lives and hopefully change their futures. But how best to do that in the same way as how best to create cultures of prevention and support vary place to place, and you all will know the right answers if you feel called to this issue of where you have grown up, of where you spend your time, certainly better than any of us on this stage would.
I want to raise one other issue before we go to the Q&A. There are a lot of international students here. There are a lot of students who go to school in America who were born somewhere else. There are a lot of people who were born in America whose projects and commitments here are around the world. In other words, a lot of us are resisting this sort of uber-ethnic nationalism rhetoric that we see in Washington. We want to grow with the rest of the world. Now, there is a proposal to, as you well know, cut the development budget of the United States government by some 36%. And ironically, if you ask the American people how much of the budget we should spend on development, they would say 3 to 5%. And you ask them how much they think we spend, they say 10 or 15%, when in fact we spend 1%. So we have this twisted, upside down, crazy thing where actually if we knew the facts, we would be trying to expand our development budget and our partnership. That is, instinctively, there's a working majority for a world with more partners and fewer adversaries, but it's all been clouded up with all this dreck you've been living through for a while. And so here's what I want to ask. I've been listening to all these things these young people say. And Chelsea and I spent a lot of our lives the last few years going around the world looking at our projects. And I will never forget when we did a climate project in Malawi in a very poor villages. And all this stuff was financed by credits they got for rebuilding trees. So the two of the villages did the smart thing. They chose to use the trees that produce fruit and they could sell and they can make money. One of the villages, however, in the hottest part of the country, wanted trees that would grow very quickly and produce lightweight wood for housing because all the housing was brick or mud and people were suffocating in the heat. And they got their climate payments, through the credit system. And this is in a part of the country that had a per capita income of less than $1 a year. So the village had to decide how they were going to spend their climate credits for all the new trees they planted. They voted to keep 55% and give 45% to their neighbors so their neighbors could participate in the program. How many people in the United States who make 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, 1,000 times that would never do that? And so I guess what I'm asking is, what would you say to these young people who we're sitting here trying to give them $1,000 for a project, and they're watching America cut back hundreds of millions, for God, maybe even billions and billions of dollars in international aid? Even the Gates Foundation says the world cannot replace all these cutbacks from the government. But they think they can. What would you say? Should they throw up their hands and just do American projects, or double down and prove to the rest of the world we still care about them? And this is a very big issue because this budget is not resolved yet.
I would tell you to hurry up. So, Mr. President, my views on foreign aid, you can well imagine. They're informed a bit by my own experience. Some of you might know I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And people ask often kind of what was that like, as if you could sum up 2.5 years of your life in like 2 sentences, which I can't. But if you'll indulge me for a minute here, I will tell you a story that I think best encapsulates what I think that program's all about, and what foreign aid's all about, and what we all can leverage if we do this the right way. I was in service for about a year. I was on my way back into the Peace Corps office in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic where I served. I had just stopped by and saw my old host family, and I was on my way back into the office. I got on the public transportation, which in the DR was called a guagua, which is essentially a van meant for 8, like a minivan, with 25 people hanging out of it. And I was in the second to last row. I had my backpack on my lap and I had my head down, minding my own business, and I get a tap on my shoulder. And I turn around and it's an older Dominican gentleman. I'd never seen him before. And he asks in Spanish, he says, "Cuerpo de paz," wondering if I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And I said, "Yeah, how'd you know?" And he looked at me like, "Really?" Didn't blend in quite as well as I'd hoped. He then, Mr. President, told me that when he was a young boy living on the outskirts of Santo Domingo, he lived in a village that didn't have running water. And a Peace Corps volunteer showed up and put in a water pipe to bring clean water to his entire village. He then thanked me, not for the work I was doing, but for the work that young man had done 30 or 40 years beforehand. He never asked my name. He never asked where I was from. He never asked what I was doing or where I was serving. He just said that he never got a chance to thank that guy 4 decades earlier. A couple moments later, the bus stopped, he got off, and I never saw him since. I don't know if I'd recognize him, and I don't know if he'd recognize me. The point is that forget about the couple $1,000s that pipe is actually worth. Set aside the hours and hours of hard labor that was put forth to try to bring clean water to those villages every day. Think about the fact that that young man's service 4 decades ago meant so much to that little boy that 4 decades later he was thanking a stranger in a bus that he just happened to come across. And ask yourself if we are not better than that, if we cannot live up to that ideal, because Peace Corps almost every year has applications that far outnumber the slots that we have available. You have spoken eloquently about this throughout both of your lives in public service. The American public, the world youth, when challenged, answers that call time and time again. This isn't even close. And some of the proudest moments of our history are when we do answer that call, and some of the most shameful moments are when we don't, and we in fact put that burden back on our children to do so. We celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Little Rock Nine not all that long ago, a couple weeks ago, I believe, when the country was forced to confront its conscience when high school kids were forced to do what a federal government wouldn't. And so can we do this? Yes. Should we do it? Absolutely. And this is so far within our capacity to do so. And it's heartbreaking to see the attacks come on this the way they do, because not only is it not true, not is it false, but it denigrates, I think, the best parts, or some of the best parts of America's assets, America's youth, America's spirit, and America's generosity. So I'm all in with you, and I'm all in with you guys too.
In other words, whatever they do with the foreign aid budget, keep working overseas. Keep working in other countries. Okay, here's the questions. Lula asked, what? Luca asked, where is potential middle ground in the deeply divided American society?
I think it's important to be clear about which divisions we think are truly surrounding a middle ground and which divisions we think aren't. And I say that because I don't think there's a middle ground to bigotry. Like, I don't think that racism or sexism or homophobia or transphobia or Islamophobia, I mean, those aren't opinions, right? There's no middle ground if you're denying someone's equal humanity. And so I think it's important when we're trying to answer questions about how we move forward, that yes, of course we include the larger we, and we want to move forward for everyone, but we are not equally validating everyone's opinions, even if we're equally investing in public health and education. And so we have to both, I think, be able to defend our values while also still make the type of affirmative arguments that certainly my father made when he was in office, that Joe is trying to make every day while he's in office, that all of us here are trying to make kind of as citizens, as activists, as advocates. And so I think focusing on concrete questions while also not compromising on our values, I think is the way for us to move forward. But I think searching for kind of a middle ground when someone is devaluing someone else's humanity is not an argument and not a productive use of time for those of us who believe that every human life has equal human value. I think it is an important kind of exercise to always be engaged in how best can we tackle the questions that do not discriminate, whether that's on the opioid epidemic or on improving access to education, improving access to healthcare, improving kind of health equity, and so many other things that we've talked about on this stage and kind of throughout the weekend. So,
Congressman, yesterday, thank you. That was a good answer. As somebody who is a product of that part of the country that produced the current government in Washington, grew up in it, and knows it like the back of my hand, I'm very grateful for Chelsea's answer on that question, because she spent the first 13 years of her life there. But I wanted to ask you this, just to follow up on what Chelsea said. Yesterday we had an astonishing visitor here, part of our panel, who is from this part of Massachusetts. He's an African American who was for many years, a rock and roll musician and played with Chuck Berry, but became famous for writing a book on his encounters with members of the Ku Klux Klan. And he went out across our country seeking members of the Ku Klux Klan without ever accepting the unacceptable, but determined to encounter them, as Pope Francis says we should. And so what I would say is, how do you deal with these people in Congress who are part of the real tough guys on the other side? Have you given up on them voting for you, and do you want to at least have a civil conversation with them? How do you deal with this on a daily basis?
Well, so, Mr. President, I try to do two things. One, tactically, engaging in some of these issues as a national debate, as you well know, does not often move members of Congress, because we don't really care what's happening outside our district, but you care a lot about what's happening inside it. So that's where national polls and national sentiment and all the rest of that stuff is kind of nice to know, but I care what the folks that I represent care about, and everything else is kind of just nice to know. The more you can localize these issues, the more I can break them down into getting to know members, getting to know their districts, getting to know those communities, and break that down and say, okay, you're not going to engage in climate change or the Affordable Care Act because it's Obamacare, but we can talk about opioids. And we can talk about the fact that Medicaid is the largest payer of mental behavioral health services in the country. And we could talk about the fact that you will do an awful lot to try to make sure that your constituents get access to the care that they need, in which case there's a couple of levers that we can push and pull. That might have a lot to do with the structure of Obamacare. Let's leave that name out of it, and let's deal with the local issue. I think it's what, sir, you and your family are so well known for. It's meeting people where they are. It's understanding that it's not good enough for progressives to say that we value everybody equally and then talk over people or talk down to them. It means that an awful lot of that anxiety, well, I wholeheartedly agree with Chelsea emphatically, you don't accept bigotry. I do think a lot of this anxiety is stemming from a observation that our system of government has overlooked a segment of our population now for an awfully long time. You, because of your background and your family, have been able to give voice to that in the past. We had moved away from it. And I think there's a bit of a challenge on us that if you believe that every voice counts, that those members of Congress, particularly in the House, if they were doing such a bad job, they would have been voted out because there was just an election 10 months ago, and they were voted in. So even if I dislike them, if you value the voice, if you value democracy and you value the voice of their constituents, you got to recognize the fact that they voted for them for a reason. It's my reason, my responsibility to figure out why. Because on first blush, I have no idea how you might have gotten elected, but you did. And that's my responsibility.
And I would also add to of what Joe said in linking back to something that Sanjan said earlier on our panel about the importance of messengers. And so we know that's true not only in our country, but really around the world. And so if we look at kind of the mechanisms, the people who really have been able to make a difference on sometimes harder public health issues, it's often been vaccine workers. And so vaccine workers who have been kind of clearly given such a grant of trust because they're vaccinating people's children, often have been the people who then have been likely, and the same people, not just the same organization, but the same people who've been able to go have conversations about using an insecticide impregnated bed net appropriately, which requires more effort from a family than just kind of getting your child vaccinated, but may not actually be as frightening a prospect, or even having conversations about sexually transmitted diseases, because that kind of grant of trust, that bond of trust has already been established and then can provide space for possibly not only kind of an extension of those conversations, but harder conversations to have. So I think that what Joe said is not only applicable in this country, and it's not only applicable to elected officials, it's applicable kind of as a ethos, but a set of questions to ask about kind of why is someone able to do something or not, and how to close that gap in terms of kind of what really can make a difference while also not compromising our values.
Let me just ask you to think about something, then we'll move on to the next question. In the last election we had, the biggest dividing line was not, from an economic and social point of view, was not per capita income. It was mobility. And it was the intersection, therefore, of economics and society and psychology. That is, the current government, the current president was supported by more counties and rural areas that represented 36% of America's GDP. Though the median income of his supporters was slightly higher than the median income of Hillary's, the county she carried represented 64% of GDP. And this is really important. Those of you who are young may not believe this, but there will come a time when you understand this. The worst thing that can happen to you, particularly if you have your own children and you long for them to have a better future, is to begin every day looking in the mirror and believing that every single tomorrow will be just like yesterday, and you are powerless to change tomorrow. That is different than your current economic circumstance. But if that happens and you think you're static, then you think everything else is static, and you tend to fight what are called zero-sum games. You want to divide the pie differently. And not just the economic pie, the social pie, the political pie, the whatever. If you believe a new tomorrow is possible and there are trustworthy partners available, you may be more open to different things. A lot of the places that the congressman mentioned, these other congressmen, a lot of those people got elected because they were the most articulate voices available for, you're getting a raw deal here, everything's stuck, you're not mobile, I'll win what fights are available, I'll name the buildings after people you like or whatever it is, and I will try to get you a bigger slice of a static pie. You need to think about that. The mobility, one of the things that happened in this country that is deeply troubling over the last 20 years is there are now 8 or 9 or 10 more countries where children can expect are more likely to be able to do better than their grandchildren than in the United States. That's why immigrants are important, because they have hope and they create jobs and they all work like crazy and they give us diversity and they give us hope. But you should think about that. Now, there are 2 good questions here from Jordan and Samantha, and I want Congressman and Chelsea to answer this. So the first, I think, is really good. We all have felt this, all of us nudges who are policy wonks or whatever. Samantha says, how do you motivate peers and classmates who aren't as passionate as you are about this stuff? And Jordan says, What's the best way to get your voice heard when you're surrounded by people who are against you? Welcome to Congress, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, I wish I knew on the second one. So, look, I think the answer actually comes of an important thread for both of them, and this sounds hokey, but I actually think it's true, is listen, right? People are more inclined to listen to you if you've listened to them. One of the most amazing things for me in going to Congress was if you actually watch a debate on C-SPAN, which I'm not so sure many of you do, but if you ever did, you'd realize that we talk right by each other. Very seldom does anybody actually engage the other side in the substance of the debate. We look at one issue one way, Republicans look at one issue another, and you never actually engage in the substantive disagreement. You're never going to resolve that issue unless you do. Understand what the motive is driving somebody that disagrees with you, what the underlying, if there is an underlying frustration there. And if you can tease that out of them, you will be able to find a way to get to some sort of common ground, unless you can't, in which case you got to stand firm and you got to then go convince everybody else. And that takes time. There's no short fix to this. There's apps for some things. There's not apps for everything. And there's no substitute for this stuff in social change from looking somebody in the eye, asking them what's on their mind, or trying to take the time for you to convince others why this is such a big deal. But you got to have credibility with them first. And just popping in about an issue that you've never, imagine how credible you'd find somebody else if they said, hey, this is the most important topic in the world that you never heard of, and talked at you a million miles a minute, and didn't bother to ask a question or for you to engage in them. You say, okay, you're nuts. I've got a million other things I got to do. You're trying to take more of their time out of a busy schedule to focus on the thing that you think is important. If you're going to do that, you got to invest in them a bit too. So unfortunately, you got to be in this one on the issues you really care about, willing to roll up your sleeves and dive in for the long haul, because there's no shortcuts in this one.
What about
I completely
apathetic?
I completely agree with everything that Joe just said, and I think that it's important when listening to also kind of be candid about what you agree with and don't agree with. I think people respect when we're kind of authentic and engaged authentically, be clear kind of what we're for and what we're against. And particularly if we're arguing against something, be clear about what we're for, so it's not just kind of negative opposition. And I was so struck by what Joe said around credibility. I think it's also important to kind of ensure that if we ourselves don't have direct experience with something, even if we're so profoundly convinced it's important, to kind of give platform and voice connection to those who do have real credibility. It's why I was so grateful to Michael and Vivek earlier in the conversation around the opioid epidemic. Michael is a recovering addict who's given his life to addiction recovery, and Vivek is someone who's treated addiction, even though that wasn't what he thought his life was going to be when he went to medical school. And so recognizing that sometimes the way that we can be kind of most authentic is to kind of share space, voice, agency, sometimes literally a platform with those who are kind of in the trenches every day about something. And to the question about apathy, I think trying to collapse the distance between people and the issue that we would hope someone would care about, whether that is something that might seem remote, like climate change. So if Joe's talking to someone, saying, like, I imagine you probably also have mayors in your district who have sewage overflows. Right? That's not disconnected from what we're talking about. So I think as much as things can be personalized, either through stories that we ourselves can share or that we ourselves can bring into the conversation from others who have real credibility, is a way to hopefully encourage others to recognize something that is already relevant to their lives, and hopefully at least be in kind of a shared space and conversation.
I got a question here that, whether you know it or not, is relevant to whatever you're interested in. So I'm going to give them a shot at this. We have been very blessed at the Clinton Foundation by the help of socially minded corporations that work all around the world that have done amazing things, that give away amazing money, get things done. But the inequality in America and in much of the rest of the world, but especially here, has been made worse by a 40-year shift in what it means to be a corporation. When I was the congressman age, back in right after people moved out of caves.
I think you were two-term governor at that point.
The law was that corporations were creatures of the state, privileged with certain things and full of obligations, which included the right to do their business for the benefit of their customers, their employees, their shareholders, and the communities. The law now is, here are the shareholders, everybody else gets the rest. And oh, by the way, we're paying the top management based on the stock price. This is a drastic change from what the law was before, and it is not the law in many other countries. That kind of attitude will not contribute very much to resolving the problems in America or create the kind of wellspring of cash we need privately to work overseas. And it was a big part of the carrier air conditioning problem in Indiana. So Chelsea worked in the private sector and in finance. The congressman is dealing with this every day. Several companies are trying to represent multiple stakeholders by becoming so-called B Corps, benefit corporations. But this has a very practical impact on increasing or decreasing inequality in America and creating the mindset to do what should be done in the world. So Vincent says, what can we do to help make sure companies incentivize to value people, the planet, and profits?
I was going to hope you pointed to Chelsea first on this one. So what can we do? Look, a big part of this is obviously structural. Some of you might have actually had time this morning. Mr. President, you mentioned that Carrier, the example of Carrier Corporation in Indiana. There's a big lead story in the New York Times this morning from the company next door on a woman that worked at a ball bearing company and how that her job got outsourced to Mexico, shut down and sent to Mexico. And a long, powerful story detailing the exact same story that you just laid out. We are supposedly in the midst of overhauling our tax code. Tax law, I think, has something to do with this. Not all of it, but certainly has something to do with it. I think there's some of us that are going to do our best to try to inject some conversations around some of these issues in this tax reform package. We have to see if we'll be successful. It is where we need voices to be raised to try to make sure that, and the great thing about B Corps and some of the incentive structures that can be put in this way, trying to provide some opportunity for saying, look, while there might be a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders, if you do invest in people and the planet, one, I would argue profits probably do come with it, but if they don't, you're not going to be held open to a shareholder liability lawsuit. Or the CEO isn't going to become the victim of something saying you violated your fiduciary duty to your investors. So creating some sort of safe harbor there so that you can, in fact, have these companies that are looking at double and triple bottom lines and not just so focused on short-term stock price, which is often how CEO compensation is, it's linked to that stock price and how performance is measured. And yes, make no mistake, they've got an economic argument to say, if we're trying to recruit the best CEO and everyone else can pay them X many millions of dollars a year, we have to do the same thing. Fine, but you've created a ladder where that gets worse and worse and more stratified, rather than actually linking these incentives to people, community, and more than anything, I mean, this is a major philosophical thing here, which I don't necessarily wholly want to open up, but our country is wedded to the idea of GDP is the ultimate measure of success. GDP measures nothing of happiness. GDP measures profit. GDP measures productivity. GDP does not measure satisfaction. And I think it's important for policymakers not to link those two, because they are very, very distinct.
Well, and I would argue not to mistake one for the other, which I think is where, unfortunately, a lot of our political debate lies at the moment. I also think we should expect more out of the major shareholders. I mean, so many of the major shareholders of kind of the biggest corporations in the world are pension funds. Pension funds from here in the United States, pension funds from around the world, pension funds that represent teachers, firefighters, doctors, public employees. And so ensuring that retired or current teachers, doctors, firefighters, public employees kind of know kind of what their dollars are facilitating or not in terms of corporate responsibility, I think is hugely important too. And I think that's an area where young people can really play a role, not only in ensuring that kind of groups of people are educated, but that your own parents, your own grandparents, your own aunts and uncles, your family members, your family friends kind of understand that connection, I think is really important. Because while I totally agree that our tax policy should reflect our values, and agree that kind of Joe and his colleagues have a real role to play here, I don't think it's only about Joe and his colleagues. I think it's also about putting meaningful, positive pressure on corporations from their shareholders so that their understanding of fiduciary responsibility also shifts. So I think we should expect a lot out of Joe in this, but we should also expect a lot out of ourselves here too. And the final thing I would say about this is, what we heard from Lisa Jackson earlier vis-a-vis Apple, and finally taking, thankfully, responsibility for believing its role in the circular economy isn't just about getting to carbon neutrality or hopefully kind of net negative carbon emissions, but also ensuring that its supplies are being either derived in a kind of sustainable way and everything that means, or that its supplies are fully recycled, is also hugely important, because we know that rare earth minerals that come from Congo that go into smartphones are one of the reasons that Congo, as we heard kind of last night on the panel, has been just seized repeatedly into civil wars over the last many decades now. So I think this question, while it was centered in the initial answer here in the United States, has to be more of a global answer, as well as we feel a solidarity for answering kind of the valuing of people, employees, communities, culture in a global sense and not just a national one.
Becca asks, this is for you, Congressman, and then I'm going to ask a question to both of you. Becca said, you obviously have strong beliefs, but how do you work with the other side to get things done without giving up your beliefs? You've got a whole family history of being a genius about this. All of you, you have generational genius. So talk about it.
Mr. President, it's a little awkward to have a third-term congressman try to answer that question standing next to a two-term president of the United States. So do you want to take first crack at it?
Yeah, I think that's fair, actually. I think you should answer this one, Dad, first.
Well, first,
I'm with Joe on this one.
First of all, read the Constitution if you're an American. The Constitution has divided government, right, in 1,000 ways. Executive, legislative, judicial branches, federal, state, and local government, all kinds of other things. The Constitution might as well be subtitled, "Let's Make a Deal." I mean, it was designed to prevent abuse of power. It was born in the 18th century when people were more worried about abuse of power by public absolutists, namely monarchs, than by private concentrations of power, which arguably is a greater threat today in a variety of ways. So in our system, unless we're prepared to give up our democracy for authoritarianism, which some people would dearly love, I'm not one of them, I'd rather have an argument and a fight. So the first thing I say to you, if you're worried about compromise, is would you really prefer to live under a circumstance where you fought every 4 years to get your way 100% of the time? Are you so confident you're right all the time? And aren't you really mad, not because you have to compromise, but because the people you're trying to deal with don't want to compromise at all? I think most of us, once we trust each other, want to compromise. I watched Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat compromise. I watched Nelson Mandela put the leaders of the parties that kept him in prison for 27 years in his government, forcing himself to compromise when he had gotten 63% of the vote. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not weak, it's strong as long as it's principled. And you know what you will not do. The most dangerous thing in a democracy is the actor who will not renounce any option. If you're going to get into a compromise, you have to know what you honestly cannot do. You have to be prepared to fail in order to really succeed. But look, one of the reasons we even talk about this is that people don't trust each other anymore, which is why I like what Joe said about getting to know people. If you trust somebody, won't you let them disagree with you? If you trust someone and they disagree with you, you don't necessarily think they are dissing you, disrespecting you. Anyway, I just listen. I agree with you. First, listen. And then ask yourself, when you ask someone else to accept a compromise, knowing what you know about them, can you honestly look them in the eye and say, this is why I think it's in your interest to do this? When I argued with Boris Yeltsin, I never said, do this because America wants it. Do this because you got to give us a little for us to give you a little. I said, this is why I think this course is best for you. And because he trusted me, even if he disagreed with me, we could keep working until we hammered something out. You should remember that. One of the reasons we even ask questions like this anymore is that nobody trusts anybody. And it's very important. Arafat once signed a map that gave a road to Israel as a matter of international law because we didn't have time to change it. A mistake was made. And I said, do you realize you just gave him this map? He said, oh, I'm going to give it back. I'm going to give him the road Monday morning. Arafat looked at me and said, his word is worth more than any written contract. The more we can get back to that, the more you won't have to worry about that. So, what can individuals do in communities suffering from the opioid epidemic? This is a big question. Next question from Sam.
Well, and I think we are running out of time as I watch the clock vanish. But I think this is an important question to end on, and I will take kind of the first quick stab and then ask Joe and then ask my dad to finish. And the reason I think this is an important question to end on is that we've talked about kind of governments and companies and kind of NGOs, and we've talked about kind of what we each think people can do as voters, as activists, as advocates. But kind of segueing from what my Father was just talking about, kind of more into our immediate lives, I want to kind of offer the words that Vivek Murtha left all of us with before, sort of engaging with compassion and an open heart. And the reason I think that's such an important thing to do in this question related to the opioid epidemic is partly because of the suffocating extent to which stigma still exists, not only in our country, but around the world. Not only related to opioids, but related to addiction more broadly. And so creating an environment driven by compassion and an open heart hopefully ensures that as soon as people realize that they're struggling, that they can ask for help. And as soon as they realize that kind of they won't be judged, not only will they hopefully kind of ask for help, but kind of give any of us the privilege of helping them stay the course so that they sustain kind of their recovery. So I would just say on a human level, engaging with compassion and an open heart, kind of with our family and our friends first and foremost around these questions, so that those of us who may never know an addiction can help those of us we may know who we would have never known to have an addiction, to give them the safe space to raise their hand and say, I need help, will you help me?
Exactly what Chelsea said. I won't repeat it, but that is exactly right. That's what I would suggest. The only thing I'd say to build on it, my first campaign, I was a prosecutor before I ran for office, and a lot of the cases that I ended up prosecuting were kids not much younger than I was at the time that were hooked on opioids and went from pills to heroin, and then were breaking into cars and homes to try to sustain a drug addiction. And I talked about it a lot in my first campaign and when I was going house party to house party. And almost every single time, somebody at the end of as I was running off out the door to the next event, somebody pulled me inside and said, hey, my son, my neighbor, my cousin, my friend. Almost every single time. And it was so powerful to me because I knew you had examples every single day of how you were striking something that people knew was there but couldn't quite say. But why that was also the problem, because they weren't saying that yet. Open up in front of everybody else and say, that was my problem too. The single biggest thing we need to do on this is take down the stigma. Because once people will stand up publicly and say, this is something that's affected me and my family, or my neighbor, and not with shame, you will get the public pushback to actually do the hard reforms that we have not yet done. So creating those support groups, mimicking those programs that I talked about earlier, like that school did, making sure that people know that there are other people out there that they can go to, where you can speak up, where you can get the support, as Chelsea talked about, I think is so incredibly critical.
Chelsea said, we're done, but you should conclude us. So I will try to conclude us. First of all, I want to thank the Congressman for his extraordinary service and his great performance here today, and we really hope. I want to thank Chelsea for being a relentlessly driving force behind CGIU and believing in all of you and working for you all these years. I want to thank all of our great sponsors and all the CGI staff and Bill Winsel and all the good people who did that. I want to thank all the volunteers. And let's thank President Aoun and Northeastern University. They were so great to us. I want to leave you with this thought. Every great problem at its root is an identity question, because how you respond depends on who you are and who you have decided to be or allowed yourself to be conditioned to be. Now the great questions of human society, as since the dawn of time, have been all wrapped up in a new package and presented on your doorstep. And once again, you are forced to claw through the illusion that all these problems presented by the social media or Facebook or the Russians there or all this kind of stuff is something new. It is a very old question. Shall we grab what we can now, being on the cutting edge of a change that others only dimly understand and can be made idiots by? Or shall we say, no, our common humanity is more important than that? We have to find a way that we can turn this magical tool into something that is much, much more good than bad, and step out the bad with a fly swatter. Can you have an argument with somebody and still respect them and listen to them because you know we're more alike than not? And at the bottom of it all, we're just asking the same old question over and over again. Which is more important, our interesting differences or our common humanity? Do I want to live in a world where the only way I can win is to beat your brains out? Or would I prefer to live in a world where the only way I can win is for you to be elevated and get up every day thinking, gosh, how lucky I am. I live in a world where I can choose how to spend my waking hours, where I can take care of my children, where I can look forward to a brighter future. Listen to all this debate all over the world today. One says economics is about addition. The others say, no, it's not. It's about subtraction. Society is about addition. No, it's not. It's about subtraction. Real security is about multiplication. No, it's not. It's about division. Get away from me, you dangerous whoever. I'm telling you, it's the oldest story of humanity, all dressed up in a bright new suit. And it would be tragic indeed if at the time in human history when we have the greatest potential to lift each other up, we instead decided that we got more psychic power from tearing each other down. This kind of thing can be just as addictive as opioids, just as paralyzing, just as maddening to the human spirit. I was living for this CGIU because I fight it every day now for obvious reasons. And I knew by the time I spent a couple of days with you, I'd be in a wonderful humor again, that I might almost be worthy to be my daughter's father again. I'm telling you, this is really important. You were involved in nothing more than a modern version of the oldest battle of human society. Who am I? Who are you? How shall we be together? How shall we treat our children? What shall the future look like? Is it addition or subtraction, multiplication or division? You have already chosen. The question is whether you have the courage, determination, and get the empowerment and support you need to keep living that way. Dear Lord, I hope so. You should have the best time in human history, but you have to make the same old decisions right. Go do it. Thank you, and God bless you.
Moving to the country, I'm gonna eat a peaches. Moving to the country, I'm gonna eat a lot of peaches. Peaches come from a can, they were put there by a man.
Ladies and gentlemen, the closing plenary session is now concluded. Please enjoy the CGIU exchange and dinner at Cabot Center this evening. Please remember to join us tomorrow morning for the CGIU Day of Action.